Welcome to our 11th webinar, Orientalism, Moral Imagination, and Ottoman Jews. You all know what Orientalism is. It will be the focus of our first presentation in a very general way. Moral imagination, a concept coined by anthropologist Julie Livingston, will be unpacked in our second paper. Now, I feel obliged at the outset to open a parenthesis and assure you that we are not jumping on the bandwagon of Kulüp, the new Turkish TV series on the Sephardim. So many people brought it up as they got the notification for this event that I felt urged to make this statement. On the other hand, I must admit that I'm not sorry about the timing, and I very much hope that Kulüp's wide popularity will help bring some further attention to the serious scholarship on the topic. As always, my gratitude goes to my beloved colleagues at Istanbul Global Center, İpek Cem Taha, the director, Merve Tezcanlı İspahani, academic programs coordinator, and Seden Gürlek, program officer, and to James Leitner for his generous sponsorship. I thank our participants, Rachel Smith and Nancy Cole, for their fine research and provocative arguments. We are most grateful to Professor Julia Phillips-Cohen for accepting to be our discussant. Her expertise opens new perspectives for us. Ottoman Orientalism has been discussed to some extent in recent scholarship, bringing to our attention the wide literature produced by Ottomans on the Arab provinces. Rachel approaches this topic by turning to Ottoman Sephardic Jewish travelers to Syria and shows uncanny parallels with the accounts of Muslim Ottomans as well as Europeans. The two big concepts at the center of her arguments are civilization and race, with the word savages repeatedly used to denote the lower echelons of societal and cultural hierarchy. Significantly, Jewish intellectuals single out Istanbul as a center of civilization, in addition, of course, to its natural habitat, Europe. The themes Nancy Cole investigates in her contribution cover Jewish historical memory, amnesia, and state violence. With a nod to Rachel, she frames her arguments around race, but now in terms of global racial capitalism. Her case study is the island of Rhodes, with sponge trading at the center of the island's economy. Her chronological bracket is from the 1840s to the 1940s. Framing her analysis by the important Jewish scholar Abraham Galante's moral imagination, she casts light on both historiography and on late Ottoman, early Republican history. Now, a few words on the backgrounds of our speakers in the order that they will present. Rachel Smith is a PhD candidate at UCLA, about to file her dissertation titled The Jews of Yesteryear, Ethnography and the Politics of Representation in the Late Ottoman World. The title explains Rachel's research areas so well that I don't need to elaborate on them any further. She holds master's degrees from the Jewish Theological Seminary and NYU, and a BA from, again, NYU. She participated in scholarly conferences in many universities and published chapters in academic journals and edited books, most recently in Wartime North Africa, Jews, Muslims, and Christians under occupation, Race Laws and Internment, edited by Omar Boom and Sarah Abramaya Stein. Nancy Cole is a third-year PhD student at Columbia University and the recipient of the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans. She holds a master's degree from the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and a BA from Harvard University with highest honors. Nancy's research is on the social and political production of Jewish difference across the Ottoman Empire and Iran. She participated in many scholarly meetings, and she currently hosts a very interesting podcast with new authors, most of them historians, for the New Books Network. Julia Phillips-Cohen is an associate professor of history and Jewish studies at Vanderbilt University. She is the author of Becoming Ottomans, Sephardic Jews and Imperial Citizenship in the Modern Era, 2014, and together with Sarah Abrevaya Stein, Sephardi Lives, a documentary history, 1700, 1950, 2014. It is amazing. Both of these works came out the same year. Her articles have appeared in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Jewish Social Studies, Jewish Quarterly Review, AGS Perspectives, American Jewish Studies Perspectives, and American Historical Review. She's currently working on a new project on Jewish women's lives in the late Ottoman Empire. We can't wait to read it. Let me conclude by giving you the good news that the first group of papers from our webinar series have been recently published in the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, in short, JOTSA. More will follow. We are most grateful to the editors and to OTSA. Today, we have only 2 speakers, as opposed to our earlier groups of 3 and occasionally 4. This allows for slightly longer papers, not very long, 20 minutes each, as well as a slightly longer discussion and Q&A session. Thank you. Now, Rachel.
My talk for today is entitled Mapping the Racial Terrain of Ottoman Sephardic Travelogues. I'd like to think through with you some of the historical and analytical entanglements of race and Orientalism through the lens of Ottoman Sephardic travel literature. Scholars have already pointed to Orientalism as one type of racism, and attending to race can help us to position dynamics of Orientalism within a more global frame, both historically and analytically, as I'll show. Eschewing the language of race obscures the extent to which the Ottoman Empire was, by the second half of the 19th century, in the throes of a global racial hierarchy. As scholars have noted, questions of race, civilization, and progress were at the forefront of Ottoman intellectual discourse. The dominant criterion for civilization at the time was often race, which served as a reference point for ethnographic texts, texts that sought to discern, describe, and assess levels of savagery and of civilization. So it's attention to race that can help make ethnographic texts like these travelogues legible. On an analytical level, as Geraldine Heng has cogently demonstrated, the use of race enables different tools and analyses. It reveals key analytic connections, for instance, between Orientalism and other types of racism, not only on the part of European Orientalists, but also among Ottoman Orientalists, including anti-Black racism within the Ottoman Empire, as scholars like Eve Trout Powell have demonstrated. But it also elucidates more global connections. When we talk only of Orientalism, we risk provincializing the Ottoman Empire by segregating these dynamics from broader, more global dynamics of racism. So by applying race as an explicit analytic, we can see how racializing discourses carried across religions, time periods, and geographic contexts. In mapping the racialized terrain of Ottoman Sephardic travelogues, this work seeks to contribute to the growing literature on race in the region and more globally. Scholars of both Ottoman studies and Jewish studies have examined how various communities deemed quote-unquote Orientals, including Ottoman Muslims and Ashkenazi Jews, have been perceived as objects of the ethnographic gaze, and in turn, how these communities have responded to Orientalist discourses. But we have yet to fully explore Ottoman Sephardic Jews' work and subjectivities as ethnographers themselves. Doubly racialized both as Jews and those deemed Orientals, Ottoman Jews adopted and adapted racializing discourses. They situated and represented themselves and classified and hierarchized others. So today I want to look at racializing discourses within two travel accounts from Ottoman Palestine. Abraham Rosanes' 1867 Masaot Hacham Bir, published serially in the Prussian Hebrew journal Hamagid, and also Jacob Shaul's 1896 Impresiones de Viaje en Palestina, which appeared in the Izmirli Ladino newspaper La Buena Esperanza. This was a time of major political, structural, and cultural transformation across the empire in response to foreign encroachment and territorial losses. In the wake of the Tanzimat reforms that, among many other things, empowered lay leadership at the expense of the clergy, within Sephardic communities, a new coterie of lay leaders challenged the erstwhile rabbinic elite. They established schools and newspapers that advanced European languages and ideas. And both Rosanes and Shaul contributed to these reformist efforts to reshape their communities. Within Ottoman Palestine, in efforts to centralize control and raise revenues, the Ottoman state established a new provincial administration in the 1860s. This new administration worked to impose Ottoman rule of law, to stimulate agricultural production, settle Bedouin communities, and secure the borders against potential British incursions. Extending Ottoman rule in the region required new infrastructure, and the state built new government buildings, roads and railways, telegraph and ferry lines that linked the local economy more closely to the regional economy. The advent of direct Ottoman rule and the creation of infrastructure helped to facilitate travel and the arrival of those like Rosanes and Shaul. A little bit in terms of biography might also help situate these works. Abraham ben Israel Rosanes was part of a pioneering generation of Jewish intellectuals who moved in Enlightenment circles both locally and internationally. He was born and raised in Ruszczak in Ottoman Bulgaria to a wealthy and well-connected Jewish family, which helped make it possible for him to undertake the long and quite expensive journey to Palestine. Although little is known of Jacob Shaul, similar to Rosanes, his ability to undertake an extended trip from Izmir to Palestine and publish his account reflects a higher socioeconomic status and their shared intellectual capital as writers. Although they wrote 30 years and hundreds of kilometers apart, both shared a positionality as Ottoman subjects, but outsiders to the region of Ottoman Palestine, highlighted in their inability to speak Arabic and their reliance on translators and guides to navigate both the land and their interpersonal encounters. And this is especially apparent in the absence of the voices of those living in Palestine, leaving us wondering how they might have represented the same encounters. I'd like to focus on a few main ways in which race operates in these accounts, through terminology, geography, and chronology. Within these texts, racial categories emerge as a tool for group marking, group formation, and it marks social boundaries and solidarities. Rosanes and Shaul hold a tripartite schema of Jews that includes Sephardic Jews, those who Rosanes refers to as, quote, our Ashkenazi brothers, and Jews who speak Arabic. And though there are some fascinating variations that come up in these accounts, such as Shaul uses the term, quote, indigenous Ashkenazi Jews of Sfat. And although they are critical of these Jews who live in Palestine, their dress, their eating habits, and their schooling, they still remain part of what Rosanes and Shaul both perceive to be a shared community based on religion. And this is in contrast to those who Rosanes designates as, quote, the people of the land. Rosanes and Shaul refer to Arabs in Palestine in demeaning terms as heretic souls or impassioned fanatics, robbers, or most commonly savages living in tents. For them, Arabs may refer to Muslims or Christians, but never Jews. And Rosanes' account particularly highlights his anxiety at the idea of crossing the boundaries that he has drawn between Jews and Arabs, between civilized and uncivilized. Perturbed, he writes of adopting Arab practices. For example, he states, I fed myself rice from my hand according to the customs of the Arabs, and I was like one of them, to my dismay. This anxiety also surfaces in Rosanes' concern when he writes, for example, about the Jews of Nablus. He urges readers to, quote, Have mercy on a city like this and poor people like these, that they should have the peace and blessing to go every Sabbath to pray and to teach their sons Torah and how to write, because without this, they will grow up like savages in the desert. He fears that the Jews of Nablus will become savages without prayer, knowledge of the Bible, and literacy. For Rosanes, all marks of civilization. In contemporary accounts from Ottoman Muslim intellectuals, some similarly envision Islam as a civilizing force, but they also draw on the same trope of the savage and referring to those living in the far reaches of the empire, and especially for nomadic populations like Bedouin. Yet when we look out at the larger racial landscape, we can see how the figure of the savage was part of a much wider symbolic field that helped to racially constitute parts of Europe since at least the 15th century. Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has demonstrated, for example, how for hundreds of years, different peoples filled what he refers to as the savage slot, which was an inherent part of the West's geography of imagination. And in the 19th century, this savage slot was marshaled by imperial projects as evidence of a global evolutionary racial hierarchy, one that was used to legitimize domination. It's this wider context that helps us to more fully understand this figure of the savage, even in these Sephardic accounts, and which we may lose when we fail to look beyond the frame of Orientalism. Racial difference is further mapped onto the geographical terrain of these accounts, inscribing the land itself as uncivilized, unhygienic, unruly. Outside of Jerusalem, Rosanes and Shaul depict the land as devoid of markers of civilization, including hospitals, inns, public parks and gardens, as well as security. Rosanes writes that the land is not civilized and orderly like the lands of Europe because of the many savage robbers who disturb our Jewish brothers. Further, the cities are putrid, the crooked and narrow streets with no order to them, filled with garbage and mud, houses haphazardly stacked, as he writes, so that every stranger who goes into a yard cannot find where he came from and where he's going. Within Jerusalem, Shaul highlights the discursive construction of uncivilized spaces by juxtaposing the old and new cities of Jerusalem. He emphasizes the old cities, quote, many dark and narrow streets and the old customs of the Arabs. And he writes about how leaving it leads to a wide boulevard, one lined with beautiful palaces, stores, hotels, cafes, and other buildings that are richly constructed. Rosanes and Shaul depict the ongoing process of civilizing the landscape through new houses built in European styles, railways, paved roads for carriages, and plans for a tramway. These linkages of the desert with savagery and cities with civilization were also well-known hallmarks of what scholars have termed Ottoman Orientalism, the equating of Europe and Istanbul with progress and the present, while identifying the imperial provinces, particularly rural areas, with savagery in the past. Like Muslim intellectuals and bureaucrats, Rosanes and Shaul were especially disparaging of rural Arabs and the fellaheen, those, quote, living in tents. Shaul recounts their fear of the trains. He writes how it's curious to see, even still, how the fellaheen lose their minds in seeing the train. They believe it's a large animal that screams, and when breathing emits a large amount of smoke from its mouth. This proves the level of ignorance of the rural Arabs. In showing how they are at odds with the railroad, a symbol of civilization, Shaul marks them as decidedly uncivilized. Now, scholars have noted travel through geographic space often maps corresponding temporal terrains. Rosanes and Shaul transpose biblical memory onto the land, as when Shaul romantically notes that it is in this region that our forefathers, who were shepherds, brought their sheep. It's curious for the imagination to cast back many centuries. Seeing this historical place makes one remember many events. Shaul also describes the enchantment he felt upon visiting the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. He writes, "You cannot understand the emotion I felt in the moment when I entered. It's a place that calls to mind the wonders of 1001 Nights." In addition to this more biblical and at times romanticizing time that cast the land and its inhabitants back millennia, both Rosanes and Shaul evoke an evolutionary chronology in which societies progress from savagery to barbarism to civilization. Within this racialized evolutionary paradigm, signifiers like savage emerge as temporally based racial classifications. And scholars have long noted how temporal logics lay at the heart of Ottoman Orientalism. But also, more broadly, they emerge in what Charles W. Mills has called racial chronopolitics, a temporal counterpart to geopolitics, a global politics of time, one that shapes the representation and material relations between groups and the world. Through both biblical time and evolutionary time, Rosanne Singh Shaul engaged in a racial chronopolitics that temporally locates the land and its inhabitants in the past in ways that call for their rescue and for their redemption. And it's true, Rosanne Singh Shaul both write from their political commitments. Rosanes describes the deplorable impoverishment of Jewish communities there, and he calls on readers to make donations, seeing them especially at risk of savagery without obtaining a proper Jewish education. So he directly implicates his readers, calling for their own solidarity with the larger Jewish world. In contrast, Shaul's depictions are more similar to those penned by the teachers and administrators of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Franco-Jewish organization established in 1860 that sought to regenerate Jews through political advocacy and French-style schooling. So Shaul advocates for similar reforms in advancing Alliance schooling and building up Jewish agricultural colonies. These calls for intervention bring us back to Mill's concept of chronopolitics and how racialized temporal representations can affect the material relations of different communities. This is certainly visible at the level of Ottoman officials, harnessing racializing discourses as part of their work modernizing the empire, building roads and hospitals. But we can also see how it's true on a smaller scale among Sephardic reformers like Rosanne Singh Shaul. Applying race as an explicit analytic, a lens that still remains underutilized in Sephardic studies and Ottoman studies, reveals how racialized notions of savagery and civilization undergird such ethnographic texts and render them legible. As a form of race-making, ethnography helps to open up new ways of thinking, not only about Ottoman discursive racialization, but about how such racializing discourses have moved across religions, centuries, and continents. Contextualizing Orientalism within this wider racial landscape thus opens up new conceptual and analytic tools. For example, here seen with the savage slot or racial chronopolitics, tools that can help us to better understand how racialized discourses work to shape political realities with material consequences, including, as we've discussed here, for Sephardic lives, consequences that would continue throughout the twilight of the empire and long after its fall. I'll now turn it over to my friend and colleague, Nancy Coe.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So today I'd like to speak to you all about the relationship between Jewish historical amnesia and state violence. More specifically, I want to address how the interplay between historical amnesia and state violence in late Ottoman and Republican Turkey might actually transform how we understand racial capitalism on a more global scale. To traverse these intersections of memory and amnesia, race and capitalism, I want to direct us to a seemingly innocuous place, a modest commercial island in present-day Greece called Rhodes. Now, when Rhodes hosted the armistice negotiations between Israel and Arab states in 1949, the UN Bulletin gestured to the negotiations as the first time the island had been spotlighted since Alexander the Great conquered it in 332 BC. But for the eminent Turkish Jewish historian Abraham Galante, Rhodes was no stage to ancient history. It was home. Perhaps this is why, as he recounts in his 1935 History of the Jews of Rhodes, Galante felt compelled to bring with me whatever documents I could find about the Jews of the then Ottoman island, as he departed his teaching post in Rhodes for a new one in Izmir in 1902. Galante's youthful mission, it turns out, would be a prescient one. In 1944, a year after the Italian-occupied island surrendered to Germany, 1,615 Jewish residents of Rhodes were deported to Auschwitz on the last transport from Greece. So when Galante published an appendix to his History of Rhodesian Jews in 1948, his implication was clear. The Nazi deportations would not have happened if Rhodes had remained a Turkish island. At a time when the Jews of Europe were everywhere persecuted, read his account, the Jews of Rhodes lived 390 years under Turkish rule, protected as they were by the Turkish government and people. By seeing Rhodes as proof of the conditions under which anti-Semitism can and cannot happen, Galante enacted a process that the anthropologist Julie Livingston calls moral imagination, the attempt to make sense of our present crises by remembering a past, and in this case, a place in which such suffering was hardly possible. For Galante, there was no Jewish question in the Ottoman Empire. Now, by now it's become anodyne for us to characterize Galante's moral imagination as part of the organized amnesia of Armenian genocide denial and its attendant crimes. In 1942, the Turkish parliament unanimously adopted the infamous varlık vergisi, an exorbitant wealth tax targeting the republic's non-Muslim citizens. Given only 15 days to pay a tax that was, in some cases, more than 100% of their assets, many had their properties seized by the state and were even sent to labor camps. Within Galante's oeuvre, mention of the wealth tax remains nowhere to be found. In its place was a script in which magnanimous Turkish officials protected loyal Jewish subjects from anti-Semitic Christians. By expressing a figurative indebtedness to the Turkish state, Galante closed the curtain on the Greek, Levantine, Armenian, and Jewish citizens who were rendered literally indebted to the state, and thus compelled to leave Turkey. As Turkish and Anglophone scholars alike point out, state violence was enacted through, not just forgotten by, this moral imagination. During Galante's tenure as a member of parliament when the wealth tax was unanimously passed, one historian observes, he chose silence. At the same time, others have recognized the need to qualify arguments about the complicity of Jewish communal memory in state violence. And to do so, we often make overtures to the dilemmas of non-Muslim citizenship that Jews faced amidst state suspicions towards their Christian neighbors. One biographer wrote, "Surely Galante was aware of his duties as a historian, but how could he have been more candid without endangering the state of the Jewish community in the face of a xenophobia that was unable to distinguish between the different non-Muslim ethnic groups?" Writing on an earlier iteration of the script that Galante would later reshape, Julia Phillips Cohen draws on her audience's implicit understanding of the Asian American model minority myth to convey the dilemmas of the Jewish model millet in the years following the Russo-Ottoman War, when novel suspicions towards Christian subjects transformed the narrative practices of Jewish communal leaders. Now, I share in the critical and compassionate dispositions behind both of these ways of understanding how Jewish communal memory relates to state violence outside of the Christian European context. However divergent these approaches may be, they share a crucial observation. In Cohen's words, Jews in the Ottoman Empire, like Jews in the United States, have not filled the role of the paradigmatic other, as was so often the case in Europe. In the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, there was not so much a Jewish question as there was a non-Muslim question. Yet by spatially distancing Galante and Ottoman Jewish historical memory more broadly from the Jewish question, I venture that we risk reinscribing rather than describing the terms upon which Galante's moral imagination relied, without connecting the shifting valences of this moral imagination to the broader history of global anti-Semitism. It is all too easy to pathologize Republic Turkey's strategic triangulation of Turks, Christians, and Jews as a primordial clash of civilizations, resurrecting a narrative that has proliferated, especially since the 1821 Greek Revolution. Equally, it becomes all too tempting to accept the conclusion that Jews were perennial understudies in the theater of Ottoman Christian relations, homogenizing the politics of Ottoman Jews into Ottoman Jewish identity politics, without fully appreciating how such politics was connected with and actually shape-shifted in relation to other struggles under the global conditions of British finance capital. Indeed, the script that Galante wrote in the aftermath of the Holocaust was an adaptation, not a rerun. In what follows, I will briefly sketch what it took for Ottoman Rhodes to persist in the moral imagination of Abraham Galante, even after Rhodes ceased to be under Turkish rule. To explain how a script set in Ottoman Rhodes remains compelling across Galante's long career, despite considerable transformations from late Ottoman subjecthood to Turkish citizenship, and considerable differences between the majority Christian island and the Ottoman Empire's other polities, I argue that Galante's organized amnesia was structured by, not just extraneous to, the intertwined history of capitalism and anti-Semitism elsewhere. It is through these comparisons that his moral imagination rendered state violence like a compelling response to the crises of capitalism across Ottoman and Republican Turkey. Galante's moral imagination was, to borrow the historian Aaron Jakes' formulation, not only an analytical disposition to be corrected or excused, but also a way of apprehending the world particular to the history of capitalism itself. Now, for those of you in the know, Galante's script of Jewish indebtedness towards Turkish benevolence brings to mind a centuries-long tradition of Sephardic apologia in the Ottoman Empire. But his was also a more temporally proximate and spatially specific script. Its primary setting was Rhodes, 1840. In 1948, Galante would observe that the dwindled community of Rhodes still gathered to sing a Purim song about the blood libel levied there a century earlier. As the tune went, a Jewish merchant had come to Rhodes to trade in sponges, thereby disrupting the monopoly shared by the island's Greek and Catholic divers. To earn their vengeance, as the lyrics go, the rival merchants resorted to the slander of ritual murder, accusing a Jewish vendor of kidnapping a Christian child. It was only thanks to a firman or decree from Sultan Abdülmecid, read aloud in both Turkish and Greek, that the slander of ritual murder was condemned, as it had arisen that year in both Rhodes and, more famously, actually, in Damascus. Yet the violence persisting on the island by the time Galante pursued his primary school education there in the 1880s was not principally about Christians, Jews, and Muslims at all, at least according to the Ottoman state. In her meticulous study of the court case surrounding the 1840 blood libel, Olga Bodovaya notes that 1841 was the last time that it would be mentioned in Ottoman court records. But, as I was lucky to find, the island of Rhodes itself continued to preoccupy the Ottoman state's internal affairs department. By the mid-19th century, American and European merchants had begun introducing a new technology to islands like Rhodes, a diving suit called the scaphander, which enabled its wearers to more efficiently collect sponges. The new tech came with a deadly downside, as divers, desperate to repay their debts to European investors, took their scaphanders and themselves too deep into the waters. But that didn't stop the scaphander from inspiring foreign investors, notably the British Sponge Company. By 1865, the Ottoman state implemented its first restriction on the scaphander in an attempt to balance its treasury's increased profits with the debts that inevitably followed. The depressed profits that resulted led divers to emigrate towards more profitable shores, including the new nation of Greece, and even, at the height of Chinese exclusion, white settler colonies like the United States. In the decades that followed, the state's paper trail at turns retracted and reinforced its original restriction. This bureaucratic indecision reflected a new reality. By the time they funded the Greek Revolution of 1821, the British had become addicted to lending their money abroad, thanks to the higher returns that they could find there. Over the next century, the Ottoman Empire would be no exception to such predatory lending. On the front pages of periodicals like Tearruf-i-Muslimin, activists lambasted the istikraz meselesi, or debt issue. While the 1840 blood libel continued to be sung, the events on the island suggested a narrative double. The accusation might not have only reflected primordial Christian anti-Semitism, but also, given that the accused newcomer was not just Jewish, but British, the racialized fallout of global finance capitalism. When a young Galante brought the memory of Rhodes with him to Izmir, however, it was not to critique the historical conditions that produce anti-Semitism, but rather to celebrate a reform-minded Ottoman society. Yet this moral imagination about Turkey was directly informed by news of anti-Semitism from elsewhere. Writing for the Archiv Israelite in 1903, Galante reported that the atrocities in Kishinev, the pogroms there, reverberated in Izmir, where there was a current of sympathy for the Jews. Recalling the trial of 49 Izmirli subjects who were tried in 1901 for a blood libel accusation after a Greek merchant's apprentice disappeared, Galante evoked the Sultan's decree following the 1840 blood libel in Rhodes. And he was not alone. So too did the Muslim, Greek, and Armenian defendants on the case, Tevfik Nevzad Bey, Hristaki Hamadapulu Effendi, and Nazaret Effendi. They too, Galante wrote, strongly condemned the slander of ritual murder. Belying this idealized scene, however, crises on Rhodes continued to play out on the well-financed stage of nationalist occupation. While the Ottoman government grasped for a way to mitigate mass migration from Rhodes following its most recent Scaphandra restriction, Italy occupied the island in 1911. In a prelude to the Balkan Wars, numerous Rhodeslis migrated, in fact, to Izmir. Yet even as it ceased to be part of the Ottoman Empire, Rhodes continued to define Galante's moral imagination. Izmir was a theater of massacre the day the Greek army occupied it in 1919, Galante wrote in his History of the Jews of Izmir. Alluding to a League of Nations mission deployed to survey Izmir's occupied inhabitants, he emphasized that one patriotic Turkish respondent, the president of the Jewish community of Izmir, had originally been on the Court of Appeals in Rhodes. But unlike his journalism in 1903, Galante's history writing this time around did not extol the possibility of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian solidarity against anti-Semitism. Rather, it simply rendered Christians as foreigners. This shift relied on the splicing of two reels in which Rhodes had played an exemplary role and which we've seen today. The mounting crises of finance capitalism on the one hand, and claims to Ottoman justice on the other. Yet from Turkey to Egypt and actually Europe as well, an emerging class of political economists framed their critiques of foreign domination not through the language of anti-capitalism, but through the language of indigenous capitalism. Amidst growing civilian discontent about the conditions of capitalist occupation and the rise of the Soviet Union, these figures felt threatened by the unprecedented challenge of international solidarity movements. Galante's moral imagination, then, circumscribed his political imagination. He proudly recorded how one Jewish shareholder, Rafael Amato, protested the ceding of his Izmirli company to Greek ship owners. According to our company's specifications, insisted Amato, the shareholders must all be Turkish subjects. Galante's history then deliberately excluded other forms of politics that Jews partook in, including, as Devinar shows, cross-confessional workers' movements. Instead, he criticized foreign domination in the name of the Milli Iktisat, or national economy, which takes us back to the Varlık Vergisi. In Prime Minister Şükrü Saracoğlu's words, the wealth tax was guided by the aim to value the Turkish currency. This fetishized indigeneity capitalized on a double vision of its own. Many of the non-Muslim businesses targeted were, in fact, British companies. As documents from the British National Archives demonstrate, the UK Embassy and Foreign Office hoped that the principle of mutual equality established by a 1930 Anglo-Turkish commercial treaty would convince the Republic to exempt the many companies with a predominant British interest from the wealth tax. Yet it was precisely because of Britain's long history of predation that the Turkish government invoked that very principle of mutual equality to maintain control over foreign businesses incorporated as Turkish concerns under Turkish law. Meanwhile, the century-old scene of the blood libel on Rhodes, where the owners of the British Sponge Company had also been investors in Catholic institutions there, was flexible enough to accommodate the cynical deployment of equality. By now, the social fallout of global capitalism could be personified, not just in the British Jew who was accused, but in the Christian capitalist accusers. It was thanks to the lived unevenness of global capitalism and colonial restructuring that, without too much cognitive dissonance, Galante was able to defend the underlying conditions of capitalism that, elsewhere, had produced the very anti-Semitism that he argued was absent in Turkey. Across Jewish and Middle East studies alike, scholars unwittingly reenact this moral imagination. Writes one historian of Jewish Izmir, in the long arc of Ottoman history, the legitimacy of Jewish difference was simply not in question. It was class, not race, that mattered. But as the financial capitals like London and later New York entrapped the Middle East in cycles of indebtedness, and as Chinese workers were barred from migration to Anglophone settler colonies as a tonic to what anxieties about free labor, class and money was racialized. It's understandable why the opposite might seem true. Implicitly centering Atlantic slavery as our paradigm for racialization, we tend to assume that the consequences of racial hierarchy chiefly manifest in overt segregation. Middle East studies is no exception to this assumption. The culprits change, but the script remains the same. Whether because of Greek or Turkish nationalism, European Zionism, or the Balkan Wars, the 20th century transformed the Ottoman Empire's modern culture of coexistence into spectacularly violent states of separation. To complicate things further, our historical subjects often share this logic. In 1910, for example, one Ottoman journalist visiting San Francisco extolled the benefits of pan-Islamism when compared to the Jim Crow South. The Italo-Turkish War, he went on, had become an excellent weapon for anti-Muslim media to slander Islamism and Ottomanism. Will the Ottomans be treated in the same way as the civilized Americans treat the Negro? He presciently worried. What is lost in this assumption that racialization only looks like segregation, however, is the dynamic process by which arguments about coexistence, which played out on the global stage of racial hierarchy, produced violence backstage. My point is not to refute arguments about whether coexistence truly existed on the ground. As Andreas Guidi cogently shows, daily intercommunal relations was the norm on the island of Rhodes, even under Italian occupation. But as Galante's shifting deployments of Ottoman roads exemplify, claims about coexistence became operational to how state violence remains compelling to both its perpetrators and onlookers. The absence of the Jewish question was not, as it too often seems, a footnote to a broader non-Muslim question. It was its very condition of possibility. In her early work, the Black studies scholar Saidiya Hartman famously coined the term scenes of subjection to explain the anti-Black violence disguised perniciously under the American rubric of pleasure. Galante's moral imagination, I argue, animated a counterpart set of scenes, one that concealed state violence under a global rubric of coexistence. Of course, Abraham Galante had set out not to forget, but to remember. Let me weep, he wrote from Rhodes in the wake of the Nazi deportations, for his late sister Rachel's husband and their sons and those sons' wives and children, for his sisters Leah, Mazal Tov, and Rosa and their families, and for his good childhood friend Rachamim Cohen, the former president of the Jewish community of Rhodes. Meanwhile, when the Swedish diplomat Folke Bernadotte selected Rhodes to host the Israeli armistice negotiations in 1949, he did so believing that the island was a sort of Mediterranean Switzerland, an archipelago of neutrality independent from lobbying by any side. Little did he know what had transpired backstage.
Okay. I'm going to say a few words about each of the papers. I will try not to go on too long so that we can leave some time for Q&A, but I'm happy to add further thoughts later should they arise. Rachel, I'll start with you. I was interested after reading and hearing this piece to hear more about the individuals in question. And especially, I was really intrigued by your mention of their utilization of guides and translators, and if you have any more information about their actual, the way they moved through space and what we know about their travels. You mentioned something about their positionality, their politics, their aims, but I'm also interested if you can, and of course, today in this context, you'll only be able to offer you a brief distilled version of that answer. But if you can think with us about how and where they got their ideas from. What's the backstory to this? You mentioned Trujillo, and in this context, I'm thinking of the scaffolding, basically the ways in which these accounts were formed and what went into the formation of these accounts. So both the sort of mechanics of their interactions on the ground and their utilization of guides and translators, but also their own intellectual trajectories to the extent that you can recreate those. And of course, you might need to use a kind of microhistorical lens and not about these individuals, but a broader context to put us in this moment. I also wanted to hear you think a little bit more comparatively. Of course, you talked about Ottoman Orientalism and the way that Ottoman Muslim intellectuals and others viewed people in places like Ottoman Palestine, similarly to the two Jewish authors you're discussing. But I wanted to hear you think a little bit more about the way this fits into Ottoman Jewish writing more broadly. And I know it's something that you work on more broadly. Certainly, as you pointed to briefly, this resonates with the perspectives of the representatives of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. I'm thinking in my own encounters with material produced by Ottoman Jews that it's such a complex landscape, and you hint at this, right? Because you talk about the tensions between being doubly Orientalized as Jews and as Ottomans, while still simultaneously Orientalizing others and the landscapes they were encountering in late Ottoman Palestine. And of course, that doesn't come as a surprise. We know that this was a broader phenomenon. And yet I would love to know, perhaps if not about Rosanes and Shaul in particular, from your broader research project, how you see people negotiating these tensions. Do they ever flag the tensions? Because those don't come up as much in this particular snapshot. And I also am thinking about not only the work on the Alliance, but also work by people like Aziza Kazum, who has talked about the great chain of Orientalism and the way that Jews were both Orientalized and then projected that positionality onto others. And so basically, I guess what I'm asking you is, how does this fit into a bigger picture? And that would be my second question after asking you about the backstory of these accounts. And then finally, my final question for you, you offered this tantalizing suggestion, and here your approach and Nancy's converge, asking us to think about race as a means of deprovincializing late Ottoman history, or Ottoman history more broadly. And I wanted to ask you precisely how you think this works. In other words, the material that you presented today, or perhaps material that you're drawing from more broadly in your dissertation project, how does it help us deprovincialize Ottoman history? Put another way, if you were speaking to scholars who work on racial formation and global racial hierarchies from an Atlantic world perspective, what would you tell them maybe helps us rethink the field more broadly, sort of bringing the Ottoman and Jewish perspective into these broader conversations? Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah. So Nancy, my question for you, I'm going to start with one that's somewhat related to the question I just posed to Rachel, which is, I was taken with your proposal that we use the analytical category of racial capitalism to read late Ottoman Jewish history. And I want to hear more about the mechanics of how you see this playing out specifically. So if in a sense I'm asking Rachel to sort of broaden out the lens, I'm asking you to zoom in and walk us through perhaps just 1840 and the blood libel in Rhodes, or possibly the 1901 case in Izmir, but any particular case that you see really showing the way that racial capitalism was at play, and just kind of walk us through how you think that operated, briefly, of course. I'll ask both of you to sort of give the elevator versions of your answers. I was also really interested in your thinking about violence, and you talk about state violence. And I wanted you to pause and just explain your operative definition, how you're thinking about violence. And is it always state violence? I wasn't sure. Perhaps if you unpack this kind of individual moment or two for us, we'll have a clearer sense of how you approach that concept, if it's sort of moments of outburst, or if you're talking about a broader kind of pattern and structural phenomenon. And then in this case, you know, I wonder that if for such a short presentation, or for such a sort of limited format, if you could think about what using such a broad time frame of 100 years offers us, but also at the same time think about the trade-offs that taking that wide, long view holds. I mean, I was concerned that because of this short time frame for your presentation, but the long time frame of the scope, that you weren't able to do some of that kind of unpacking that I asked you to do to finish it, I should say, because you offer really tantalizing suggestions about the way that the scaphandre suit and the sponge trade and all of these different sort of people's different national identifications all overlapped, but I wanted to hear more. And so I'll leave you both with those broader questions and let each of you say a few words before we open it up to the broader audience. So maybe Rachel, you can begin just to follow our original order.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for these fantastic questions, especially at this point where I'm still sort of in the process of fleshing out this dissertation chapter. These questions are really helpful. So starting with some information on the backstory of these accounts and the individuals in question, what's interesting is that they both casually reference guides who are helping them, who take them from city to city, who speak Arabic and are translating, while also sort of denying them any real space in their travelogues, any real agency, so that even as they completely rely on them and are dependent on them, they still discount their role in sort of figuring these interactions that they're having. And there are a couple points, especially in Rosanes's travelogue, which is just much longer and so provides more material, where we see him really sort of struggle because he's so unfamiliar with the land and the people and the customs and practices. So for example, he demands to be taken to a bathhouse, and he has sort of actually a bit of a coterie of servants who are with him, and none of them want to go in the bathhouse, but they tell him not to spend too long in there. He goes in there, he's 20 minutes in there, he comes out and faints, right? It's like everyone, they rush to bring him water and to have him lie down somewhere, sit somewhere comfortable. But it's a scene that really shows his inability to navigate the land and the culture, to the extent that he actually puts himself in harm's way by disregarding the advice of those who he's traveling with and who are showing him around. He also is frustrated when he can't find particular gravestones in a cemetery. He wants to pray at the gravestones of certain saints. And he tries to find 3 different times people who can show him around this cemetery, and he is unable to find someone. And he's so upset about this, that there aren't people who know their own land, right? So there's a couple instances where we really see how he has the power to hire people, but he leaves them unidentified. They're never named. He requires their knowledge, even to just talk or walk, but he's consistently asserting his own authority over theirs. So this is just a couple examples of some of the tensions that come up among these writers as they're using guides and translators, or unable to find the guides and translators they want to navigate the land. I know time is of the essence, so all of these questions have like fantastic sort of sub questions under them, but I'm just gonna sort of keep moving. In terms of the larger picture of Ottoman Jewish work, that's really what my dissertation is about, is exploring the larger landscape of Ottoman Jewish ethnography. And so this is just one chapter among others that look at the press, that look at ethnographic treatises and studies, more scholarly texts, and one chapter that focuses particularly on the Alliance through the lens of race. Of all of these works, I think one example that maybe shows the tensions that these writers are negotiating while writing ethnographically is the eminent Sephardic historian and scholar Abraham Galante, who's a great example because he's writing in the second half of the 19th century, 1880s, 90s, early 20th century. And he's writing explicitly ethnographic works that are premised on his distancing himself from his own community, his grandparents, his language. He's writing in French rather than Ladino. And so as a genre of distancing, cultural distancing, temporal distancing, geographic distancing, we see that struggle play out in some of his works where he sees himself both documenting ethnographic sort of cultural practices while also lamenting their disappearance. Maybe because even as he is a reformer, he knows that he is in part sort of bringing about the changes that are leading to the disappearance of older customs. So that tension is very live for these writers, some more than others, but I think it's one of the central tensions of autoethnography, that is writing about your own community, which we see quite a bit of. This talk really focused on writing about other communities, but autoethnography is also very much a part of this larger literature.
Professor Cohen, thank you so much for these questions, which actually give me the perfect opportunity to delve a little bit more into my argument. What I want to begin with is actually that to point out that, of course, this sort of new literature on critical political economy that I'm situating myself within isn't the first to talk about capitalism on a global scale. And so, of course, there's an older tradition of world systems theory that was talking about the ways in which certain sort of centers like England, like France, basically subjugated financially the peripheries. But what that sort of literature misses or sort of doesn't really answer is a question that actually you asked to Rachel, which is what happens, what about the subjects who are experiencing that subjugation, right? Like how do they experience it? How do they respond to it, right? And that for me is how this thing that I, borrowing from Cedric Robinson's vocabulary called racial capitalism becomes operationalized, right? The great historian Karl Marx once said, he couldn't really write the history of capital until it had sort of been going on for a while, right? Now, what happens in Izmir and the way that Galante writes about roads from Izmir is a great example of this, right? Because on the one hand, we know, as I tried to show, that the sort of literal death that was happening on the ground in Rhodes was not because of some sort of primordial, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, ethnic or religious conflict, right? It was happening because of this technology, because of the scaphander and the ways in which British investments in it disrupted what had been a sort of the ghost of Mediterranean cosmopolitanism, to use to borrow another scholar's phrase, right? But what's precisely interesting, and the reason why I chose to try to compress a century into 20 minutes, a 20-minute talk, is that the ways in which that violence was understood or even misunderstood over time is the story, right? We can't fully understand the consequences of what 1840 in Rhodes represented unless we understand how Galante and his peers understood that or misunderstood that, if you will, right? And what's crucial is that these misunderstandings were no less real than the thing that they were trying to understand, right? Because those misunderstandings had real consequences upon people, right? One of the things that's so interesting is that even, I focused here on arguments that Galante makes over time about coexistence, in response to the violence that he's experiencing or he is observing. But what's interesting is that even when others argued about the opposite, about primordial conflict, for example, Friedrich Nansen, who was the designer of the Nansen Passport and the League of Nations, they still make arguments on the basis of what they believe to be the capacity of racialized peoples to get along or not, right? And so he actually says during the population exchange, oh, the Greek and Turkish races cannot get along, right? And so what's interesting for me is not so much, okay, let me trace what literally happened, from 1840 onwards through a century. That would certainly be untenable. But what's interesting is how this is not really a history for me of 1840. It's a history of the present. It's a history of Galante's writing of the history of the Jews of Turkey and the conditions of possibility that made it possible for that narrative to enable state violence. So, which actually brings me to your really astute question about what, after all, is state violence, right? And what's striking to me is precisely that state violence, right? So sort of formal declarations like the Varlık-Vergisi, and their reliance on formal treaties like the Anglo-Turkish Treaty of Commerce in 1930, they all depend on implicit notions of precisely whether people are or not getting along on the ground, right? And so what happens is that this blood libel in Rhodes, right, which by no means represented how every or even most Christians on the island felt about this particular, British Jewish merchant, it becomes sort of animated, right, by the particular anxieties of capitalism that exist, right, in any particular point in time. And the reason I call it racial capitalism is not necessarily to emphasize that individuals within these scenes were racialized, but rather to say we can't really understand why it is that Galante is so fixated on 1840 Rhodes unless we understand the sort of pressures of global finance capitalism, which was obviously and necessarily racialized.
And before we turn things over to the broader audience, Rachel, if you want to also answer that question about the sort of racial analytical contribution that you add.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, I just would like to build off of a couple things Nancy said. So you had asked about how does race really work? How might it help us deprovincialize Ottoman history? And part of what I'm trying to think through is how we can situate Orientalism within this larger global racial landscape, and how that makes available different tools or analyses. And I actually think Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire are a great case study for this because they can help demonstrate how some of these larger racializing discourses or tropes both begin long before the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire, but also continue long after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. That is, some of these racializing discourses follow Sephardic Jews outside of the empire after its collapse into the US, into the nascent Israeli state. So what we see is this a much larger racial landscape that extends far beyond the Ottoman Empire. So I think this is just one example of how racializing discourses can carry across time, space, religion, very different contexts. And yet there are these really distinct continuities.
Okay, I think we are
able
able
to do the questions. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
We have a number of questions, so it's going to take me 1 minute. We have a question for Nancy. It says, Nancy suggests that capitalism can explain Galante's approach. Why do you find this more convincing, for example, than Mark Baer's explanation that uses the emotional worlds and affective states of Ottoman and Turkish Jews? And we see other Jews, not from Rhodes, make similar arguments. Certainly in my own work, one could say that comes through, but the question for you, Nancy, is how does the political economy approach handle this? And maybe, you maybe want to kind of think through the relationship of your work to others' approaches. And
of course, Nessie, thank you so much for this. And I have to also highlight that Nessie wrote a great article about Kulüp recently in Avladamos. I love this question because it gives me the opportunity to clarify a common misconception about historians of capitalism and the history of capitalism. As far as I'm concerned, the history of capitalism is deeply affective. It's deeply emotional, right? It's only by understanding the pressures of capitalism that we would understand why somebody, against all rationality, would dive deep into the seas on, wearing a scaphandre to the point of death, almost of like assisted suicide, right? It's only by understanding the pressures of, the sort of resentments even towards a long sort of century-long pattern of British predatory lending that we can understand why it is that the Turkish state would find such awful forms of ethnic cleansing compelling, right? Despite their obvious genocidal violence, right? And so for me, I find the political economy explanation important as an important piece, precisely because in a way it's a ballast against more sort of pathologizing notions of, primordial, Turkish anti-Christianity, right? The phenomenon that you're talking about, Nessie, the one in which, we see Jews everywhere within the Ottoman Empire making similar arguments, that's the conflating the sort of explanandum with the exponand in a way, because what we have to explain is why is it that people keep finding that compelling, right? And so for me, to be clear, Rhodes is not, exceptional insofar as, only Ottoman Jews from Rhodes were doing this, or only Galante was doing this, but rather kind of illustrative in a way, precisely because of the sort of coincidence that it began, it's a Christian majority island in the Ottoman Empire, right? Yet it sort of has this ghostly, persistent presence within Galante's writing, even after Rhodes stops being a part of the Ottoman Empire. So it's exactly the intersection of capital with affect or with emotion that makes this whole story kind of make sense in the first place. I feel like I'm missing an aspect of your question, but it'll come to me after.
Okay, we have another question, and I can't see a full name, but it's from someone named Will, it looks like. So it says, following up on my invitation, Nancy, to you to dig into the mechanics, the talk gestured toward Chinese exclusion, Asian American history, theory, and more globally towards scripts of racialization and racial capitalism. That seemed to invite questions on contemporary centers of global capitalism, namely the US and East Asia. For example, the Supreme Court in the US has recently taken up a case that relies on a parallel between Asianness and Jewishness. Or to offer another way into this question, Chinese capitalists in Southeast Asia are often described and self-described as the Jews of the Orient. So does, and if so, how, the script from Rhodes speak back to these alternate scripts and or reframe this larger conversation to which you've gestured?
Great. Thank you so much for that. Great question, Will. I want to pause here and just say that actually I'm deeply indebted to Professor Cohen, because when I was beginning my studies in Jewish history, one of the first sort of books that I had read was precisely Becoming Ottomans, in which you make this analogy between the millet sadaqah, the loyal millet, and the model minority. And what I think I'm trying to sort of get at, and what I get at in my dissertation, which is a sort of reimagination of the legacies of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, is that this story here is not just an analogy to Asian Americans, but actually, and the model minority myth of in America today, but actually, in a sense, a prehistory of it, right? Precisely because at the point in time that we're talking about, the status of Asian subjects or citizens in America could not be farther from the model minority, right? They were the hated, in a sense, this sort of stereotype of the coolie, right? And so we have to still understand from the perspective of historians of the US, how it is that we get from, that to the model minority, where they get this notion of, where, for example, Japanese American activists get this notion of model minority from, right? And so I think what I'm trying to gesture to is a sort of not just global, but a more historically imaginative in terms of time history of where that might come from. As for what's going on actually in East Asia itself, I love this example that you brought up about the Jews of the Orient, which goes back to, again, this thing that is circulating in both mine and Rachel's papers, which is sort of the politics and mechanics of analogy, right? And I want to actually point to one of the interesting things is that East Asia is itself a kind of site of moral imagination for Jews in the Alliance Israélite Universelle, right? Like they, when the Sassoon family famously splits off from Baghdad to, India and China, right? This notion that like China is sort of absent of the Jewish question, right? And so I think what's so fascinating though is that people within East Asia and also Russia are saying things like, oh, like one of my colleagues, Tova Benjamin, writes about the Koreans are the Jews of Russia, or this or the Jews of that, right? And so I definitely think that this is something to think further through about, especially in light of eventually East Asia's own participation in global processes of neoliberalization.
We have a number of questions. Some of the questions are broad and have to do with sort of the overarching context of Ottoman and Turkish history. So I'm going to try to just, for now, focus us on questions that pertain more to the papers to see if we can stay focused on your presentations for now, and we'll see how far we can get. Jacob Daniels writes, we just heard about at least 3 late Ottoman Sephardi intellectuals, Rosanes, Danon, and Shaul, perhaps. Would either of you, Rachel or Nancy, and Galante, one could add, would either of you like to comment on the broader movement and range of thought contained, because you have such a nice juxtaposition between your two talks, which highlight the range of political views, understandings of race, and so on of these different Sephardi intellectuals. So Rachel, maybe I'll turn it to you first because you started with them.
Sure, great. Thank you for the question, Jake. So I chose specifically Rosanes and Shaul because I think they bring very different political orientations. And we can see how Rosanes he's a rabbi. He's very concerned about Jewish learning, Jewish prayer, knowledge of the Bible. Jewish literacy in general is one of his sort of main preoccupations. And yet he also is known for establishing a modern school within Rostock. So he himself is a fascinating man who encompasses sort of different approaches to reform within his own life and work, whereas Shaul takes more of a sort of alliancist approach to his reform. And so they show us how even as they're using some of the same racializing discourses and language, and they agree on the need for reform, they disagree on what that would actually look like. And I think that that is exemplative of the much larger sort of Ottoman Jewish intellectual landscape, as you know from your own work, as Professor Phillips Cohen has shown in her work, specifically the article on Sephardic scholarly worlds, which sort of maps out what this intellectual scene looks like in the late Ottoman Empire. That includes like the diversity of Jews who are found in the Ottoman Empire is reflected in this the scope of this intellectual moment. So Jews from all different urban centers, working in different languages, traveling in different larger intellectual circles, a wide range of political commitments, especially after 1908. And so we see really a highly variegated, highly textured sort of intellectual scene that makes, for me, looking at ethnographic writing particularly exciting, because we can see some of the how it's refracted, how the quest for reform is refracted in all of these very different ways.
I can jump in as well to Rachel's really great comments and just say, these, I'll just say, on one level that, Galante was actually cited by, referred to, by other sort of Alliance affiliated officials, including Abraham Galante, when he was migrating Jews from Greece to Palestine in the 30s amidst sort of rising Greek, what he understood as rising Greek anti-Semitism. One of the things that's striking, however, is that, you know, all of these sort of intellectuals that I perceive as, at least as part of a sort of shared world, what they share is a certain conviction about what sort of is kosher Jewish politics and what isn't, right? And so, as I mentioned in my lecture, they're not talking about sort of necessarily, or at least not in a celebratory way, other forms of Jewish political organizing or other forms of political organizing that Jews did not as Jews, but as other other sort of things that they identified with. And one of the questions is sort of, where does that kind of genealogy really come from? And I think this is where contrasting Galante's work and the work of these sort of related scholars to an earlier sort of tradition of, you know, for example, Sephardic Musar literature is really informative, right? Because, you know, whereas you had a sort of Sephardic religious world up into the 19th century that prioritize, you know, learning, as Matthias Lehmann has shown, you know, the importance of the Talmid Chacham, you know, the wise student who is not a rich man. What happens with the Alliance is a sort of emphasis on upward mobility, right? The effort to regenerate the Jews of the so-called Orient was very much largely about the ability not just to assimilate and learn French and be involved in constitutional democratic politics, but also to become doctors and lawyers, right? and so I think that it's important to keep that aspect in mind, you know, when thinking about, you know, how your very good question about how these scholars sort of relate to other sort of forms of Jewish intellectualism and Jewish politics and even Jewish activism in the same period.
Okay, so, you know, some of the questions are asking each of you to sort of branch out more broadly. And is there anything that you would want to say, you know, again, moving over time, about the way the sort of legacies, the afterlives of some of these phenomena? That's my attempt to sort of encapsulate some of these broader questions in a digestible form that you can take as you will.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off here. So part of what I'm trying to trace in my overall research is how these racializing discourses, how Sephardic Jews are engaging with them, how they've internalized them to a certain extent, how they refract them, just to give us a sense, sort of actually answering Professor Chelik's call to look at how communities deemed Oriental are engaging with Orientalizing discourses. And of course, Professor Phillips-Cohen, your work has done quite a bit on this as well. And part of what I'm trying to trace is how these racializing discourses follow Sephardic Jewish communities outside of the Ottoman Empire, which is really the conclusion to my dissertation, which looks at this in a few different short vignettes. So for example, how do concerns over the disappearance, the end of different Jewish communities because of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, but also the Holocaust, lead to ethnographic reconstructions of Sephardic communities in memoir literature, for example. And how does that memoir literature still continue to engage in some of these tropes and what it means to be a developed community, one that is taking its place on this much larger world stage, for example, also in the US, or how ethnographic discourses around superstition that clung so tenaciously to Ottoman Sephardic communities becomes a trope that's picked up by the Israeli government in the 1950s and 1960s as part of an administrative effort to identify who are Oriental Jews, what do they need, what kinds of healthcare, housing, education, etc. That some of this ethnographic literature that's autoethnographic continues even by Ottoman Sephardic Jews who emigrate into Israel, especially during the formative years of the state in the 50s and 60s. But also looking at how into the 1980s, there's this fantastic set of YouTube videos of Rhodesli Jews in Los Angeles recreating on film different practices, songs, language, cooking food, trying to preserve sort of their own lost customs for their children, for their grandchildren, visually online. And so I can trace some of the ethnographic afterlives of Ottoman Sephardic communities, long after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And I think that we're still continuing to sort of see how these things are playing out today, including through racializing discourses that Ottoman Sephardic Jews meet in the US, which Professor Devin Narr's work has done a great job of charting. So I think that this taking a more global approach to Orientalism helps us see some of these connections more clearly.
Thank you for that. And I think I'll answer in sort of two strains, one a little bit narrower, one a little bit broader. The narrower one is to say that there's this sort of notion of, though there's no Jewish question in Turkey, it actually does persist, and not just in Turkey, right? So for example, strikingly in 1955, which was the same year that the so-called Istanbul pogrom happened, right? Greek businesses in Istanbul were ransacked, right? And so on and so forth. The American Jewish Yearbook actually published, they published these sort of dossiers of, the Jews in XYZ country, which part of that ethnographic tradition that Rachel's talking about, right? And they actually said there is no Jewish question in Turkey, right? And this was also after, of course, within historical memory of the Varlık Vergisi, the wealth tax, right? And so I think part of what I'm trying to get at is that we have to take to account for, in a way more sophisticated perhaps than notions of false consciousness, right? How it is that people come to understand violence in ways that are not sort of directly beneficial to them, right? And I think this sort of goes into my sort of the broader thing I wanted to say, which is that, one thing that sort of is anodyne by now within Israel studies, Mizrahi studies, and Palestinian studies as well, is that part of the violence of what the establishment of the State of Israel did was that it instituted a kind of racialization of Mizrahi, that is to say, Oriental Jewish citizens, from 48 or maybe the British Mandate in the 20s onwards, right? And part of what I'm trying to show is that, in the dissertation at least, is that while that's definitely true, right? While that there were definitely forms of Mizrahi racialization, novel forms of Mizrahi racialization that produced material forms of segregation, right? What's also true is that this coexisted with another sort of competing discourse, right, about the indigeneity, right, of Jews in the Orient and the coexistence of Jews with Muslims. And this discourse itself also begins to aid and abet a form of what Leora Halperin calls in her recent book, The Oldest Guard, hierarchical coexistence within Mandate Palestine and later the State of Israel, right? And so in a way, it's not just, my goal here is not just to sort of globalize Ottoman Jewish history writing and put it in sort of this broader frame of racial capitalism, but also sort of scale out how we understand the racial geography of Israel-Palestine today from its sort of an Ottoman legacy.
Okay, we have more questions, perhaps more than I'm going to be able to summarize. We have a really fascinating question from Leslie Abdallah about Leslie's own family and coming from Corfu, and a question about whether that's also
Hey, Julia, you cut out for a bit. Can you repeat what you just said?
Okay. A fascinating question about the potential parallels in Corfu. And then another question from someone who didn't submit a name, saying both presenters referred to the utilization and reproduction of various scripts and racializing discourses by Ottoman Sephardic Jewish men. Could either comment on what, if any, features of the moral imaginations of Galante, Rosanes, Shaul, or Danon mark them as Sephardic or Ottoman Jewish, and how does gender factor in? Now, of course, there's even more than I can get to here. So let me just try to kind of encapsulate what's on our plate, and you can take what you can in the few minutes that are remaining. Another attendee asked about whether Jews also suffered in 1955, and questions on Jewish Armenian experiences as well. So now that's all a lot to process, but perhaps you can pick and choose what you are able to answer, and each of you have only about a minute or so to try to do what you can with them. So Rachel.
Great. I think I'll pick up this question about gender because it's a fascinating one and really one I didn't have time to touch on in the short talk today. But gender is, and really the treatment and depiction of women is often a barometer of progress within ethnographic accounts. And that's not unique to Sephardic accounts, to Ottoman accounts. It's really sort of across the board. Some of what we see are really long descriptions of women, what they wear, where they go, how they speak, their jewelry, their hairstyles. There's quite a bit of ethnographic description of women. One interesting note is that within sort of more autoethnographic works that Ottoman Sephardic Jews are writing about their own communities, women are often depicted as sort of obstacles to progress. That is, it is not uncommon that they're depicted as more superstitious, more grounded in Ladino, less likely to want to speak French, which, I mean, these are accounts written by men, right? So of course we need to read them quite critically. But that is, women become sort of the focus of what is hindering Ottoman Sephardic Jews from progressing into the modern era. And I should say, not just women, often traditional rabbis, the poor, the elderly, right? Women are one group among others. And so feminism actually becomes a trope of sort of like reforming women as a panacea to all of the problems that Ottoman Sephardic communities face in being labeled as backwards, this anxiety that they have around being seen as less civilized or less advanced. So gender is a huge topic in my work more broadly. So thank you for highlighting that.
I just wanted to drop in and say it's so fascinating what you just mentioned, Rachel, in light of Naomi Seidman's work on Yiddish and women in the Ashkenazi context. So I love that. Thank you. So, right, you know, why the too early deceased historian of migration, Adam McHugh, asked, you know, why does one person migrate and their brother doesn't? So this question, you know, why your family, the Abdullah family left Corfu in 1873, you know, I'm going to claim historians' modesty and say I can't know that. But one of the things that I do think is so interesting is that, in a way, what I'm trying to trace here is a historical process via which a particular assumption, and I guess you could call it, you know, one-drop anti-Semitism, the sort of assumption that, you know, people were compelled to leave the minute that they experience anti-Semitism. This is an idea that is actually used by intellectuals like Al-Maleh to sort of induce migration to places like Palestine in the 20s and 30s, right? But as we know, right, 1840 Rhodes happens, okay, but Jews of Rhodes are still there. That's why there's still Jews to deport when the Nazis come in 1944, right? And so I think what's interesting is sort of not so much about, you know, why individual people leave, but rather what arguments about what justifies migration are actually doing, right? And one of the things that they do is to sort of exclude other forms of resistance, right, to the conditions that produce anti-Semitism or anti-Christian violence or any other form of violence in these various places, right? And so I actually, you know, love that you brought up this connection to Manchester, that your great-grandfather, Jacob Elias Abdullah, eventually came to Manchester in 1873, because precisely when these events are happening, you know, in Rhodes, at this exact same time, Karl Marx is actually writing the Communist Manifesto in Manchester, right? And there are tons of, you know, Sephardic, Syrian, Lebanese, et cetera, Turkish, Jewish immigrants migrating to Manchester at the same time, right? His history of capital ends up focusing on, industrial capitalism, but meanwhile, right, what he was sort of experiencing in the city at the time was the sort of effects of global merchant capitalism. So I think that we have to actually historicize these sort of theorists as humans as well. Quickly on the Istanbul pogrom, it's weird. Unlike the Varga said, the Istanbul pogrom in 55 mostly just targeted Greeks because it was actually triggered, I should say, by a sort of what some people say was a staged bombing of the embassy in Cyprus over a sort of territorial dispute between Greece and Turkey at the time. And it sort of then sparked this sort of anti-Greek sentiment during a period of time when Turkey was experiencing financial crisis, as was the world, right? And so I think what's interesting here is not so much, whether Jews were involved as victims, although some were, but also that when it was called the Istanbul pogrom, right, evoking the Kishinev pogroms, there was already an implicit understanding that capitalism systematically creates forms of what we call anti-Semitism, but that does not just affect Jews, right? Hence, Professor Cohen's sort of moniker, the non-Muslim question, right? It's a specific question that's related to the stresses of capitalism, right? And so I want to sort of end by saying that it's a story not just about moral imagination or even political imagination, but actually about historical imagination, about who we consider to be the proper subjects of Jewish studies or Sephardic studies when we know that these same conditions of capitalism produce forms of violence upon other subjects as well.
Wonderful. So we're nearing the end, and I'm going to turn the last word over to Professor Çelik.
Okay, I think this went beautifully. Your papers opened up a lot of questions, and I'm very grateful to you all, to Julia, as well as to our audience. Now, there's one thing I really want to bring up. It was fascinating. We heard about race, we heard about gender, we heard about capitalism. Where is class in all this? And we're talking about people coming from different classes, economic classes. And I think this is really important, something that we should pay a lot of attention to. I know it's not hip to talk about class these days, and gender is, race is, but then again, it is so crucial to address class. The writers come from a certain background, what are they? So it's easy to talk about capitalism, I will say, without getting into the specifics of it, making generalizations. And I would really like to see you deep a little bit further into it, as you have done with other topics. So my 2 cents on this, and thank you very much again.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone. And I hope that we can continue the conversation in other fora in the future.
Certainly it will continue. Thank you.
Bye-bye.